This is My Patronus is a podcast, a chapter-by-chapter storytelling exploration of Harry Potter, hosted by Ryan Cody. If you would like to support this program, please visit super75studios.com, and thanks for listening.
Hi everyone, Ryan here. Today we're going to talk about chapters 2 and 3 from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. In these chapters, Harry goes to the zoo with the Dursleys, the glass disappears, and the snake escapes. We learn a little bit about Harry's natural tendency towards magic that he doesn't know about yet at this point. And we're also introduced to how he gets his letters from Hogwarts and what is about to jumpstart the next phase of his life. So those are the two chapters we're covering today. The Vanishing Glass and the Letters from No One. All right, so you ready to get started here?
Yeah, I even have my hard copy out of the book in case I need to reference anything.
Okay, my guest today is writer, artist, actor, and all-around talented individual, Sina Grace. Thanks for doing this, Sina.
Woo! Audience applause or whatever. Hey, nice to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. It's been a while since we've chatted, so... So when
podcast.
So on the first episode last week, Scott Godleski had not read any of the books. He was just a movie guy. So when I emailed you, you said you were a big fan and you even referenced the 8th book, the play, which I read also. So it's exciting to talk to someone else who's read all the books.
Well, you know what's even crazier? Just literally as you were doing your intro, I popped open my hard copy of The Sorcerer's Stone. I have a first American edition of this book. Like, I grew up thinking, because my sister worked at Barnes & Noble when the second one came out. And so she got them both for me and was like, these are going to be a big deal. and then, you know, by the time that third one came out, like, they were huge. Right. But I just assumed I had, like, you know, whatever, like, the 8th printing or something. So this is a big moment for me, and I get to share.
Excellent.
I have like a first American printing. It's crazy.
Well, I'm glad I could share this moment with you. I left my book on the bookshelf. I don't know which copy I have. To start it off, we're going to go with chapter 2, and I chose to do 2 chapters today just because these 2 chapters are real short and nothing sort of life-altering happens in these 2 chapters, so it's easy to combine them together. So we're going to start with chapter 2, The Vanishing Glass. It's really the first glimpse into how Harry's real family treats him, and to me it kind of explains how later on how important Hogwarts becomes to him, since his real family, you know, don't treat him very well at all. He's found a surrogate family in the wizarding world, and it's established pretty early on here.
Yeah, and what's really crazy too is like how much everything, you know, because you know, when I was reading it the first time around, I was a kid, and you know, none of us had, you know, you don't know what's going to happen next, but to revisit these chapters, realizing that there are reasons for why, you know, all these things are happening and why these people are kind of treating Harry the way they treat him, and not necessarily, it's never valid, like they're really wretched to him, but it was just crazy to know where everything goes, you know, 7 books later, and to look at these kind of like mean family members, and they are mean, but then, you know, again, once I don't know how far, you know, listeners have gone, or how many movies they've seen, but yeah, it's just sort of crazy to like go back to the beginning and try to psychologize just why, like, you know, this family is kind of so wretched to him. I mean, obviously, you know, his cousin's like mean because he's a little kid and he's a brat. But anyway, sorry, I'm like blathering, and we're 2 minutes in.
Right. No, yeah, I kind of, the way I do this, I kind of assume that everyone's seen all the movies, so it's not like I'm worried about any spoilers on a 20-year-old book. But so yeah, it really does. You know, a lot doesn't go to waste, I suppose. So even like Mrs. Figg and Aunt Marge are both mentioned in this chapter in like 1 sentence each, and then both of those characters at one point through the series of the books have big moments involving Harry. So it's just interesting how, you know, she doesn't, you know, every little thing comes back at some point. So there's that, you know, she doesn't let characters go to waste. And then we also get our first kind of description of Harry the Harry will come to know. He's described, and it's a good trope for like a hero, but he's described as like short and skinny. There's nothing really special about him, so it's good that he's not a typical hero, and I think that goes to people being able to identify with him. People who feel kind of different or feel like an outsider, they identify with this scrawny kid who's treated like shit by his family, and it makes it easy to root for, on page 19.
Yeah, and I think it helps that, when you're reading it as a grown-up, it's really interesting because J.K. Rowling, she does her job in writing, she kind of makes it so you're supposed to despise these characters, but Harry's pretty benevolent to them, and he's a little Stockholm syndromed. He's just this is the way it is, and he doesn't really you don't read this through his perspective, but the way he interacts with them is just very obedient and accepting and acquiescent, and I think I think that also helps in terms of having people relate to these characters, because how many, again, in terms of identifying, I think we all grew up wanting something out of our living situation that our parents couldn't provide. And we weren't able to understand that they were tired and unable to just do it. And so it's interesting in this situation, they don't provide because they don't want to, but Harry is just the same, sort of struggling. And I don't know, it was really, again, cool to read this so many years later and kind of see how J.K. Rowling is making decisions. And like you said, with not even mincing words, so many things in this chapter come back later. We're talking about, this is the chapter 2 is with the snake, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, all that stuff with the parcel tongue. And when you're just reading it for the first time, it's this unfolding mystery, but it sets something up that is going to be played with later, and is even going to be played with sort of Harry's identity and how everything he thinks about himself is that his first thought is I'm garbage, because this family's always you're garbage. And so, remember cutting to later in the series when he realizes that was a parcel tongue thing. And immediately he thinks that's what makes him bad, that he's secretly, a Slytherin, or he's secretly aligned with the dark forces, and it all comes from these first few chapters with how his family raised him. Anyway, yeah, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, no, it another note that I noticed between these two chapters is, and you mentioned it, when Harry just kind of accepts what his life is at the Dursleys, he also kind of nonchalantly accepts everything. He talks about how his hair grew back one night after his hair got cut, and then it's back to normal the next night. Or, when she tried to put an ugly sweater on him and it kept shrinking till it didn't fit him, he just chalks it up as oh, that's weird. The glass disappeared and he could talk to snakes. Oh, that's weird. But it's nothing that obviously this book was written for adolescents, so Harry needs to accept these so that the reader could accept it. But it does go to show that throughout the whole arc of the story, Harry has no problem understanding or accepting everything that's happening to him. And it goes all the way back to, his life's shitty when he lives in the cupboard under the stairs, and that's his norm, so he's just going to accept it, and he doesn't really complain about it. It's that to me is interesting, just how she just powers through and she expects the reader to accept things as quickly as Harry does. And I think that's smart, especially when you're writing a book. At this point, it was written for children.
Yeah, and all the way in the first book too. It right out the gate.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, chapter 2 to me really doesn't have that much going for it, other than it just kind of describes Harry and kind of introduces you to a little bit of weirdness in his life. And yeah, the whole parcel tongue thing. I remember when I first read it, I was thinking oh, that's weird. Is he imagining that he's talking to this snake? I still wasn't until the second book when she came out and said that he could talk to snakes. I think I still up to that point had thought that all happened in his head. The conversation with the snake wasn't real.
Well, and it's funny too, because it's so, the humor in that I think is very sort of not weak isn't the right word. The snake is refers to Harry as amigo. Yeah. And the snake's very cool and has this sort of whimsical personality that I think later when that's applied to different magical creatures, it lands better. And then, but here it sort of was a pitfall of like, and in these earlier chapters, like a pitfall of like British world building, you know, just kind of like, oh, let's, you know, have these characters sort of say things very like, I don't know. I'm not really accurately putting to words what these first chapters do, but they sort of just have, I can't explain it, but the like kind of casual British world building vibes that are like, you know, very like kind of just like excessive with word use and description, and it all kind of is mildly whimsical. And so yeah, it takes you a minute to sort of like orient yourself as a reader too.
Yeah, and then I read these books. So I read these books as an adult. You know, I was reading them to my kids. So to me, these first two books are actually a little hard to get through because they're written. I mean, they're definitely written for younger kids, and I think she hits her stride in the third book. So yeah, something like this. You know, the passages in the first book or the second book where there's like singing, and then something like this snake that just seems to be written, like the voice of the snake, the way it speaks is just so kind of juvenile and bizarre that to me it was a little jarring. But then again, like I said, I was reading this as like a, you know, someone in their late 20s. So, but yeah, so the next chapter is actually where stuff jumps off really. And the letters from no one, and it's where Harry gets or attempts to get his letters from Hogwarts. It's interesting because it's the first introduction to the fact that the Dursleys are terrified of what Harry is, and they're terrified. I mean, it's mentioned a bit in the first chapter, but it's really driven home in this chapter that they're terrified of this entire aspect of Harry's life and Petunia's life. And so it's an interesting chapter where Harry's finally excited. Something is happening for Harry that's exciting to him. And as we all know, is going to change everything. And the Dursleys are doing their best to squash it just because they're tired of things that are different. So this is when you first get that vibe. Yeah.
And this is also when, and to kind of come back to what we were talking about earlier, this is when, you know, Harry starts piecing together like, oh, it is weird that like these people used to like bow to me or shake my hand. And like he kind of would shrug that part off. And the one thing he could never deny needing an explanation for is he's like, and they would always disappear like right after seeing them. And I was trying my best in rereading. I was trying to figure out if I could like recognize any of them, if they were noteworthy wizards from later books or if they were professors or teachers, but it didn't. I don't think they were. You know, because she describes sort of the outfits they wear being a little kooky, but they're not quite, you know, bizarre and outlandish. And yeah, it's just all the seed planting that kind of comes together. And the letters are really, I remembered thinking the first time I read this as a kid, kind of like also being a little like concerned about them because they were just so, the flood of them was a little like, you know, intimidating in a way. But I do love that actually kind of is this like symbol of just like it's unstoppable. And you know, I think a lot about like adolescent stuff and how growing up in adulthood and maturity and puberty is like represented as like a big, dark and scary thing. And I think magic can kind of be seen as representing that as like, you know, growing up and you know, growing into like adulthood. And I feel like this book is the first time that it's sort of like presented as like it can be a magical thing, like it can be a wonderful thing. It's unstoppable. It's going to come to your door no matter what you do, because it's nature. But you know, to J.K. Rowling, she's like, well, let's focus on the positive of this unstoppable part of our lives that is like maturity and growing up. And it's all told through, you know, she always just keeps her tone really, again, kind of engaged. Like she's just as interested in describing these things as you are reading them. And that's sort of evidenced when you read her detective books. Have you read those? The Cuckoo's Calling, Cormoran Strike novels?
No, I have not read them.
She wrote them as a, I'm like super nerding out on you. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, she wrote them under a fake name, Robert Galbraith. And they're good, but she does the same thing in those books where she just sort of describes everything with such great loving detail that even if there's an immensity to it or a darkness to it, it's still captivating because, yeah, she just is able to do that. She's got that power herself.
Yeah, it's good. And I'm rereading it this morning, it kind of struck me that knowing what we know later about Petunia and her relationship with Harry's mother, and that that they all knew Snape and stuff. It's funny because when you read this chapter, you just know that they're afraid of this, and for whatever reason. But Mr. Dursley, it seems like, oh, he's afraid of it because he's a stick in the mud, and anything that's different and that doesn't line up with his values is something he's afraid of. But for her, knowing what happens later on in the books, you learn that it all comes down to sort of like still like bitter jealousy. She wanted to go to Hogwarts. She was jealous of her sister, and she was trying her hardest now to sort of take out those feelings on Harry. She wanted to punish Harry because it was happening all over again, and it never happened for her, and she was upset about that, and she's always been upset about that. And so, she'll be damned if she's going to let Harry go away the way her sister went away and, live this extraordinary life. So the motivations are interesting now that, I know the whole story. Interpreting them on the reread is really interesting.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, yeah, sympathizing with them is a big word, but or maybe not, maybe an exaggeration, but upon like now knowing where everything goes and where everything was, you sort of you just have a better understanding for why these characters react. But what's amazing is still in the first read, it's such a natural, it all makes sense, but it makes even more sense, 7 books down the line.
Right, yeah. Just on like a visual note, or the way
I was just echoing what you said. I was just listening to myself talk.
No, that's good. On a visual note, as someone, I process stories really visually. I've always loved the idea of like owl mail or owl post. I love the visual of these owls dropping off these letters, and I love the way that she described or she wrote the addresses on the letters, like cupboard under the stairs, number 4 Privet Drive. And then when they moved him to the bedroom, then it was like smallest bedroom, number 4 Privet Drive. And I don't know, it's a little touch like that just I don't know, it just goes to show that the magical world has its way of knowing things, and it could be a little creepy maybe if you were looking at it in that stalking way or whatever, but it's charming in the way that she wrote it, and it's still to me it's still charming. Even when I watch the first movie, which is really not that good, but when you watch the movie, that's a fun part. When you read the books, that's a really fun moment.
Yeah, totally. It's like, yeah, she's just good.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I was just waiting for the for the big moment, but. Yeah, and the mounting, she's just good at there's mounting tension every chapter as well that somehow still satisfies. Because when you think, I'm like, in my head, I was like, oh, the Hogwarts stuff happens real early, but then here I am, and it's like, oh, it's chapter 3, and he hasn't even met Hagrid. And I'm kind of like, oh, right, like, it goes back to, like, she is able to kind of create very organically and still very magically these, like, little vignettes that sort of show where everyone is and help you kind of understand the stakes. And then once she starts knocking them out, like, then it's, that's when it all really hits.
Right, yeah, by the end of this these first 3 chapters are, well, especially chapters 2 and 3, they give you they set you up with everything you really need to know about where Harry's at in his life in just like 40 odd pages or 30 odd pages. And, it gives you as much as you need, not more than you need, and you're not left wondering anyone's motives, or, all the characters are defined. And then, yeah, it really all does lead up to, the next chapter, which introduces Hagrid, and then also introduces the entire kind of wizarding world to Harry. So it, that's one thing I like about these books, and one reason I wanted to talk about them was it is a constant forward progression. Every chapter propels you into the next chapter. That's why they're so readable and so enjoyable. And these 2 chapters do a good job of bridging, the sort of exposition-heavy first chapter where everything is just kind of told to you to set up the world. Chapters 2 and 3, create for you Harry's current world, and then starting in chapter 4, for the rest of the series, it's a forward kind of roller coaster.
Yeah.
Yeah. So while these 2 chapters aren't, they're not super exciting, overall for the rest of the book, they are necessary, and I think they do a great job of setting the table.
Yeah, and I mean, even little things like when we meet Dobby the house elf, it's all from this stuff happening in these early pages that you sort of understand why Harry is who he is and how he relates to the people that he's about to meet, You know, that's kind of what's fun about, you know, kind of doing one of these earlier podcasts with you is like, I'm so glad that it's the beginning because I haven't visited these books in so long. So it's great to sort of knowing where things end, seeing where they start. And it just kind of makes you respect J.K. Rowling so much because again, there's not a wasted word, but all of it feels like candy. You don't even realize she's world building because like everything feels just like fun description.
Right. Yeah. It's easily digestible. And meanwhile, you're getting a ton of information without it being, you know, without it reading like a textbook. And so thanks for being on the show. And I'll probably try to have you back, maybe one episode per book if you're up for it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So where can people find out more about you online? Why don't you give us a plug?
For sure. I always say I'm lucky to have this weird name. You can find me pretty much anywhere at Sina Grace. SINAGRACE. That's also my website, sinagrace.com. And I mainly like Instagram and Twitter, so look for me there.
Okay, and you got anything you're currently or you're gearing up for the first issue of Iceman? You're writing the Iceman series for Marvel, right?
Yeah. Iceman comes out in June from Marvel, and then I'm gonna have I have a new graphic novel coming out from Image Comics called Nothing Lasts Forever, which is a total downer, but really lovely book, and that's coming out I think the same week as Iceman #1. So my summer's gonna be crazy.
Yeah. All right. Well, sounds like fun, and thanks again, man. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, dude.
All right.
And now there's lawnmowers everywhere.
Yeah.
So I gotta go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think one of my kids was trying to call me. I kept ignoring him, so I should probably deal with that. So. Okay, so that's the show. Thanks for listening, everyone, and thanks again to Sina Grace for being my guest. Be sure to check him out on Twitter and Instagram, and to buy his comics that are coming out in June. So thanks, everyone, for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends, give us a review on iTunes, and a shout-out on your social media page. You can follow the show on Twitter at MyPatronusPod, and if you're a writer, artist, actor, director, or any type of creative storyteller, and you'd want to talk about Harry Potter on the show, you can email patronuspod@gmail.com. To support the show, either with a small donation or to be a sponsor, please shoot us an email or visit super75studios.com and click on the show link. Thanks again.